AgWeek Weather is sponsored by Bremer Bank. Connect with a banker today at bremer.com.
How long can we expect this mild winter to last? Here's John with our Agri-weather outlook.
The general outlook for the next 2 weeks, we're actually talking about now the close of the month of February and the start of the beginning of March, and it's looking mild once again. A couple of weeks ago, it was looking like sometime in February, the weather would be turning a little bit colder. That has really just not shown up. The coldest air ended up following a storm system out over the northeastern states and out to sea, and it's left most of the country with some fairly mild temperatures, especially the northern part of the country. This first week of this forecast period is looking mostly pretty dry. I'll show you the exceptions to that. But March is coming. Tends to be some subtle pattern changes that go on in the atmosphere as we get into March weather. Tends to be a little more active month than February, and that may be the case this time around as well. We'll show you what's happening. Jet stream flow, basically the polar jet, it got a little trough out in the Gulf of Alaska, but it's still mostly pretty far north. Here's that push of colder weather, moving it into the eastern Great Lakes and the northeastern states, following a couple of northeastern storm systems, and it remains quite cool down in the deep south. You want warm weather in the east, you got to go down to South Florida to find it. Cool, meaning warmer than average here in the northern plains, with a lot of these days this week in the 30s and 40s. Very mild weather, a little bit colder weather around the Great Lakes, and of course in the higher elevations of the mountains. As you start getting into the second half of February, solar radiation starts to win out. And you start getting those 80s consistently, getting up into the usual suspects like the Southwest, Texas, and usually South Florida. And those will push north sometimes, 70s and 80s anyway, from time to time. We'll keep things relatively cool this week across the north. Notice we're beginning to carve out another trough, another little modest push of that really cold air, but it's mostly going to remain Canadian and centered around Hudson Bay. So I don't expect a lot of cold weather this week into the United States. As we slip into the second week, starting to see a bit of a ridge trough pattern in the polar jet stream, favors cold weather in the east and a warm up in the west. Should start seeing melting conditions over all but the Rockies, but the cool down is not expected to be that extreme in the east. And toward the end of the period, as we head toward the first part of March, there is some evidence that we'll start to carve out a trough that could eventually lead to stormy weather into some parts of the Great Plains. Too early to tell. This first week, February 18th through 24th, most of the nation pretty dry. Little snow around the Great Lakes, some precipitation along the Atlantic seaboard and the Appalachians. A lot of that in the form of rain until you get far enough north. The second week of the period, the transition, this looks like a much bigger storm in the eastern part of the country and a west coast storm as well, which may eventually yield some precip out into the Great Plains in March.